The Bishop of Guildford says he was one of dozens of young boys allegedly beaten at Christian holiday camps.
I was drawn into the Smythe circle as they were, and the beating I endured in the infamous garden shed was violent, excruciating and shocking.
Good evening. He's become the first bishop to claim, like so many others, that he was the victim of a severe beating after being groomed at Winchester and Cambridge by a leading barrister and Christian evangelical. Exposed on this programme last Thursday, John Smythe has refused to talk about what he did. Numerous alleged survivors are now coming forward, but this is the first high-ranking cleric to do so. Tonight, what we now learn.
Also tonight, the judges may have stopped Trump's migrant ban in its tracks, but some refugees are still being kept out of the USA. We're with the Yazidis, terrorised by Islamic State in northern Iraq, whose hopes of sanctuary in America lie frozen. The French presidential candidate, Francois Fillon, apologises for using public money to employ his wife and children, but refuses to quit the race. And the primary colours of David Hockney, how acrylic gave Britain's greatest living painter the vivid tones he made his own.
And as Donald Trump now says negative polls are fake news, we examine the phenomenon behind the fake headlines.
I'm not going to give you a question. You are fake news.
In the first of our special reports on fake news, we talk to a man who writes it and the politician who says it threatens our very democracy. A leading bishop in the Church of England has tonight come out as another victim in the violent abuse scandal that has rocked the Church. He's the most senior figure in the Church to come forward and the first bishop to do so. It follows a 6-month investigation by this programme into the abuse scandal, which led the Archbishop of Canterbury to admit the Church had failed the victims terribly. Tonight, some of those victims have written to the Archbishop asking him to reflect on how the Church handled those allegations and whether he did enough. Meanwhile, John Smythe, who's accused of the abuse, is back home in South Africa. From there, Kathy Newman has this report.
Mr. Smythe, Kathy Newman from Channel 4 News. We're told that you beat young men until they bled. Why did you do that?
I'm not talking about that.
What did you do?
Last week, Channel 4 News broadcast graphic allegations of abuse carried out by John Smythe, barrister, evangelical Christian and former colleague of the Archbishop of Canterbury.
I'm not talking about this. I'm sorry, it's...
Don't the victims deserve to hear why you did it?
How did you know I was here?
Today, the Bishop of Guildford, Andrew Watson, identified himself as one of Smythe's alleged victims, issuing an astonishingly frank statement.
I am one of the survivors of John Smythe's appalling activities in the late 1970s and early 80s. I'm also one of the bishops in the Church of England. This has placed me in a unique and challenging position when it comes to the events of the past few days. My own story is certainly less traumatic than that of some others. I was drawn into the Smythe circle as they were, and the beating I endured in the infamous garden shed was violent, excruciating and shocking. But it was thankfully a one-off experience, never to be repeated.
John Smythe was chairman of a Christian charity called the Ewan Trust, which organised holiday camps for public school children. He's accused of violently abusing a group of boys from the public school Winchester College in a shed at his home nearby. The alleged abuse came to light in 1982, but was never reported to the police at the time. For decades, the victims say they've suffered in silence.
He made me strip off my clothes and he got out a cane and started to beat me.
What did he say to you?
I think it was along the lines of this is the discipline that God likes. This is what's going to help you to become holy.
The Archbishop of Canterbury last week apologised to the alleged victims and said the Church had failed terribly.
I obviously didn't know that he was abusing people in any way at all.
Tonight, the Bishop of Guildford expressed his gratitude to Justin Welby for that apology and said that he didn't believe the Archbishop knew anything of Smythe's alleged violent activities until his office was informed in 2013.
It was abuse, perpetrated by a misguided, manipulative and dangerous man and tragically playing on the longing of his young victims that they might live godly lives.
The bishop has spoken with Hampshire Police over the weekend. Their investigations continue.
After senior figures in the church failed to report the allegations of violent abuse to the police more than 3 decades ago, John Smythe was free to start a new life. First in Zimbabwe, where he faced more horrific claims, and then here in South Africa. With his reputation in ruins in the UK, he and his wife are, we're told, hunkered down at their home in Cape Town. Now, though, the men who say he abused them, the church and even his own children are urging him to give himself up. Kathy Newman, Channel 4 News in Johannesburg.
Well, a little earlier I spoke to the Church of England priest and broadcaster Giles Fraser, who's written of his experience of suffering beatings at his public school in the 1970s. I asked him what happened to him as a child.
Well, I was beaten at prep school in a way that was very reminiscent of these beatings from John Smythe, from when I was 7 all the way through to 12. So we were beaten with all sorts of implements, from canes to bats to anything that came to hand. Sometimes it was just a sort of immediate thing. Sometimes you'd have to wait for a very long period of time. We'd wait outside the chapel, a very gloomy, creepy chapel.
Chapel was germane to it?
The chapel was germane to it. So, and I think it's not right just to say that these beatings are the result of a few bad eggs, bad apples. I think there is a theological aspect to it, and I think it goes back to a rather poisonous brew between evangelical Christianity, public school religion, and the empire. It's about making you tough enough to rule the world. I mean, this is what they were trying to do. This was the job of the public schools. The headmaster who beat me was military police in Burma. That's what he did before he became a schoolmaster. That apparently was good preparation for being a schoolmaster. You know, there's also this thing about, oh, you mustn't tell, you mustn't be sneaks, or that somehow you're being wimpy about it. It's not. It's very important that people start to tell about that culture of abuse.
But
because
now,
it was a culture of abuse, John.
But now a bishop, the Bishop of Guildford, has surfaced. Probably there are others too.
There'll be loads of people. I mean, loads of people. I mean,
But what do you see in what the Bishop of Guildford has said?
Well, I'm very glad that he's spoken. I'm very glad that he's spoken so personally about it. I disagree with some aspects of his statement. One of the things that he said is that this is not a question of theology. This is just a question of sort of a bad man. And this is the thing that we need to face. Actually, it is a question of theology. There is some bad theology at the heart of these whippings.
What does that theology say?
That theology says that you need to be a real man. You can be whipped for Jesus in order to make you strong. You know, the Victorians are obsessed with homosexuality and masturbation, and it's a similar sort of obsession you get. I mean, the Church of England is still stupidly obsessed with homosexuality, and that's part of the psychodynamic, complicated psychodynamic that was going on then in English public schools.
But then, what about the past? This is the past.
Yes.
Could we not say it's over?
Yes, you could say it's over, but there is a problem.
Although not for the survivors, of course.
No, it's not. And I mean, you know, I still bear the mental scars. I mean, you know, long after the pain goes, it shapes you. I mean, I'm still angry about it. Over 40 years afterwards, I'm still angry about it. And, you know, it shapes the way I look at the world. So, no, it's not ancient history. And
private education, public schools, I mean, surely it's over there.
Yeah, I mean, it is over there. I mean, the interesting thing, it was banned in this country in 1999 in schools. It was banned for adults.
Beating,
corporal punishment was banned for adults in 1947 or 8. You couldn't do it to adults then. All the way through to 1999, you could do it to children. What does that say about our mentality?
This is obvious a watershed for the church. What more has to be done?
There is much more that the church has to do. And the church has to stop saying this was about a few bad apples, that classic defence. It has to take a very good long look in the mirror and say, actually, it was something about the way in which we presented the Christian faith that made this possible. And they have to do there has to be a sort of theological reckoning. And I think that people are incredibly resistant to doing that.
And how can they make amends?
I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think some of the damage will always be done. I mean, Christianity is, at its heart, a religion of love and forgiveness. And, you know, for me, love and forgiveness is what's going to get us through this. But actually, the scars for people like me and the anger run so deep. I'm not always sure, and I know I should, but I'm not always sure how to forgive in these situations, in this circumstance.
That's an incredible challenge, because you, as a vicar,
absolutely
are having to preach forgiveness.
And I think it's a terrible thing to say, and I think it's right. I think I am a lesser person for not being able to do it, or not knowing how to do it. And I think that forgiveness is absolutely at the heart of the Christian gospel and the faith. I am a lesser person for not knowing how to do it in these circumstances.
Charles Fraser, thank you very much for talking to us.
Now, the Commons Speaker, John Bercow, has joined the chorus of criticism of President Trump over his migrants' travel ban. He told MPs that he opposed any presidential address to Parliament during Mr Trump's planned state visit later this year. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has this.
5 years ago, the trumpets sounded a welcoming fanfare in Westminster Hall for the US president, just as they did in Parliament's Royal Gallery in 1982 for President Reagan. Today, the Speaker, who by convention signs the formal invitation to address both houses of Parliament, said President Trump wasn't welcome here.
Before the imposition of the migrant ban, I would myself have been strongly opposed to an address by President Trump in Westminster Hall. After the imposition of the migrant ban by President Trump, I am even more strongly opposed to an address by President Trump in Westminster Hall. As far as this place is concerned, I feel very strongly that our opposition to racism and to sexism, and our support for equality before the law and an independent judiciary are hugely important considerations in the House of Commons.
All the SNP MPs applauded. Quite a few Labour MPs joined in.
2 words, well done.
Some Tory MPs were angered by the Speaker wading in on an invitation only recently issued by the Queen via the Prime Minister. But even some who regularly criticise the Speaker for chasing headlines forgave him this.
You actually like what he said this time, even though you've been a critic for years.
Yes, indeed, because he is saying what I also think.
Now that is very revealing, isn't it? He's overstepped the mark, but in your direction, so that's fine.
No, I don't think he's overstepped the mark, because he's the Speaker of the House of Commons.
I have today been able to convey Her Majesty the Queen's hope that President Trump and the First Lady would pay a state visit to the United Kingdom later this year, and I'm delighted that the President has accepted that invitation.
Before Theresa May got to Washington, one friend of President Trump said Number 10 had already sounded him out to see if the President would expect or like to address Parliament on his trip. The source told Number 10 it probably wasn't the President's sort of thing. Tonight, Number 10 said the state visit plans were still being worked on. But now one possible excursion has been crossed off the list.
Well, the Trump administration is to return to court later to seek reinstatement of its ban on travellers from 7 mainly Muslim countries. The restrictions had been lifted by judges at the weekend, and some families have managed to fly into the US today. Within the last hour, the president has been talking to military leaders at US Central Command in Florida. This is what he's had to say.
And all across Europe, you've seen what happened in Paris and Nice. All over Europe, it's happening. It's gotten to a point where it's not even being reported. And in many cases, the very, very dishonest press doesn't want to report it. They have their reasons, and you understand that. So today we deliver a message in one very unified voice to these forces of death and destruction. America and its allies will defeat you. We will defeat them.
Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, is in Washington. What do you make of that? What are the facts?
Well, it's not true. European journalists and American journalists, of course, always cover terror attacks in Europe. And I think the impression he's trying to give is that Europe is this sort of dystopian land of terror and horror, which Europeans know is not in fact the case. But there's a reason for that. It's because he's trying to say that this travel ban, which excludes people from 7 Muslim majority countries and all Syrian refugees, is about protecting America from terror, protecting America from what Europe has, because of course there are a lot of refugees and immigrants in Europe. And he made this address to, I would say, a predominantly sympathetic audience, the military, because he's saying to the military, we're going to build you up, we're going to make you, give you all the equipment you want. That's one of his campaign promises. He has been stopped by judges. A federal judge has said that this travel ban, is not constitutional, and it has been temporarily stopped. Now that case now goes to an appeals court, and both sides, the federal judge and the government side, will make their arguments, and that judgment could be made as soon as tomorrow. In the meantime, immigrants from the 7 countries and refugees are coming into America as fast as they can.
Lindsay Hilson.
Amongst those who hope that the window of opportunity to enter the United States will stay open are the Yazidis, who, having fled Islamic State militants, are waiting in Iraqi refugee camps in the hope of being allowed asylum in the United States. They're victims of terrorism, but were banned by President Trump's broad travel ban that encompasses those 7 mainly Muslim countries and is meant to safeguard Americans from terrorism. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman has been talking to some of them.
In the refugee camps of northern Iraq live the survivors of the 21st century's first attempted genocide. Over 200,000 members of the Yazidi sect have been eking out an existence here for over 2 years, ever since they escaped the kidnap, murder and sexual slavery of so-called Islamic State. So to them, news of Donald Trump's fight to keep a 90-day ban on all Iraqis reaching America merely adds insult to a world of unimaginable injury. Yazidis like the Hassan family, who fled for their lives in August 2014. So desperate to escape this camp that 11 relatives drowned when their boat capsized trying to reach Europe.
They left the camp to go to Turkey, looking for a new life in Europe. One of my brothers and his children drowned. It was December the 9th, 2015. We only got 3 bodies back.
Anwar shows me a picture of the only 3 graves they have, and then a photo of another of her brothers, Faisal. He lives in Lincoln, Nebraska. The family has approval from US immigration to join him there. Now they're not so sure the visas will arrive.
I heard that President Trump wanted to delay things for 3 or 4 months.
What do you think of Donald Trump's decision?
I think he's crazy.
So these are your bags? Yeah. The family has its luggage packed, all ready to go. They say they stopped taking English lessons, though, when the White House ban on 7 mainly Islamic countries first came into force.
I have 3 brothers and 2 sisters.
Last night I spoke to Faisal Hassan in Nebraska, waiting for the US government to give his family the green light to fly. He's been working on the tills in a Walmart supermarket for the past year, and he insists the Hassans are no threat.
Have you ever heard like one of the Yazidi blow up himself or kill someone?
No.
That's why I'm saying my family is not threatened for America. I want for them a better life.
In Nebraska?
They deserve a better life.
Those Yazidis applying to resettle in America feel powerless in the face of distant court battles, either to let them in or to keep them out. But what makes them angry is Donald Trump's claim that he's trying to keep America safe from jihadist terror. when there have been no greater victims of that terror than the Yazidis themselves. In 2014, I witnessed the Yazidi exodus as an estimated 150,000 people fled up a mountain to escape IS. Hundreds of them died of heat or starvation, most of them children. The Naif family survived that journey, and they were expected to leave for America last week. Then another phone call told them to stay put until the legal situation becomes clearer.
It was very hard when we got the call because the journey is our way out, away from death, and then it was cancelled.
He speaks of death because two of his brothers worked as US Army translators. One was killed by jihadists and the other has already been given sanctuary in America. So staying is, they say, not an option.
We received death threats as they worked for the Americans. The fundamentalists look on us as US agents, so we think the Americans will help us and let us in.
This is the shrine of Lalish, the holiest site in the Yazidi faith. The Yazidis believe in reincarnation and they revere an angel who takes the form of a peacock, but IS brand them as heretics who worship the devil. And inside we find the Qasim family tying knots in cloth. Each one a wish, they say, that their relatives, still held as prisoners by IS, will be set free safe. The Qasims too have applied for resettlement in America. As the religious leader here puts it, Yazidis are waiting for the wolf to come back and would prefer to die outside Iraq rather than here. But these women would not. They were held as sex slaves by IS. They were beaten and forced to convert to Islam before a people trafficker was paid for their freedom.
Many charities asked us to go to America, but we can't leave until we find out what happened to our men and children. They are all with Daesh now. We have no wish for any other country.
I am not trying to go abroad. I just want to see my family again. They took my little daughter, I don't know where. I don't know what they did with her, if they raped her or sold her. I don't know.
The stories in these camps take some telling. And if there is quiet dignity in the plight of many of these persecuted people, then consider this. What to them are arguments about border checks and delays in the name of national security compared with what they have endured so far? Jonathan Rugman, Channel 4 News, Northern Iraq.
The French presidential candidate François Fillon has launched a fight back against claims that he should quit the race over payments to his wife and children for parliamentary work they never did. Speaking to reporters in Paris, he apologised for any error of judgment, but said he had never broken the law and had nothing to hide. Here's our Europe editor, Matt Fry.
It all looked so photogenic. François Fillon, the arch-Catholic, arch-conservative father of five, at the gates of their chateau in the Loire Valley. This is their chateau, by the way. And the Fillon plan was, and apparently still is, to move from here to the Élysée Palace. But the eyes say it all. There is a hitch, and it involves the quizzical woman on the left, Penelope, his wife, born in Wales. The accusation is that he paid her almost €1 million over 15 years for work that she never actually performed. He also stands accused of paying some of his children. The papers have had a field day, especially because Fillon has vowed to clean up France and cull 500,000 workers from the state sector. The Fillon leaflets now bleat that their man is unfairly hunted. But she's not interested, and the mood has turned ugly against a man who was, until recently, seen as an obvious fit for the presidency. Today, Fillon mounted the barricades and fought back.
Aujourd'hui, candidat à l'élection présidentielle.
Today, as a candidate to the presidential elections, I am facing an attack of unprecedented violence, to my knowledge never before seen in the Fifth Republic. It's the presidential candidate for the right and the centre who is targeted today, and I assume all my responsibilities. All the facts raised are legal and transparent. I was interrogated for 4 hours by the police and Penelope for 5 hours. We told them everything and we answered all their questions.
François Fillon gave the most bizarre press conference imaginable this afternoon, where he effectively denied acting illegally, but also confirmed that he will carry on with his campaign. He's effectively blustering on and hoping that his legal difficulties will just fizzle out. I don't think the French electorate will be too impressed with that. In fact, it might signal the end of his political career.
If so, what does it mean for her, Marine Le Pen? She kicked off her candidacy yesterday with a tirade against the evils of globalization and a corrupt elite. No prizes for guessing who she meant by that. And then there's Emmanuel Macron, the 39-year-old wunderkind economist who married his high school teacher and is unabashedly pro-European. Polls indicate that he would win a runoff against Le Pen. But then again, he is an ex-investment banker, and that doesn't play well in these times of insurrection. Whatever France decides, the very survival of the EU could hinge on it.
Matt Fry reporting. Here, NHS trusts in England are to make patients from overseas pay up front for non-emergency care. The government says giving hospitals a legal duty to charge, they hope will recoup up to £500,000 a year. But critics warn the plans put more pressure on the already overstretched NHS. Our health and social care correspondent Victoria MacDonald is here. Victoria.
Yes, well, John, this is the government's latest attempt to deal with what they call health tourism, so trying to get the money back for non-urgent treatment, and that must be emphasised. Currently, they bill after the event, and too often those health tourists, as it were, go back to their countries and the bill isn't paid. Now they're going to say to trusts that they have to give the bill, as it were, before the operation happens. Now, as you said, there was some concern today that this is rather a diversion from the really serious pressures that the NHS is currently under, as we've seen with A&E and delayed discharges and so on. And in fact, the Health Minister did, to a certain extent, acknowledge that today.
There are wider issues, but this is an example of one of the measures that we're taking to get a grip on an obligation that already exists on the NHS. We've had this obligation since 1982. Previous governments have made no attempt to try to recover from health tourists coming to the UK to undertake procedures that they perhaps can't get elsewhere. We think they need to be fair to the British taxpayer and to pay for it.
So is this about recouping much needed money?
Well, yes, I mean, it's 500 million, they hope, a year. I mean, they're saying to start with maybe it will be 25 million. And actually, it's not
so
true
that was a 50 million...
yes, 500 million a year is what they want to get back, which is actually not that much compared with the overall NHS budget. And they say as a start they will get 25 million, they hope. But one of the concerns, of course, he was saying there that previous governments haven't tried. Previous governments have, but it's very difficult for trusts, actually. It's very difficult, you know, trying to track someone down. What does happen at the moment, though, is if a person hasn't paid their bill, a patient will have their name put at the border agency, and they are not allowed back in the country if they haven't paid that bill.
Victoria MacDonald. Krishnan.
Now, tonight marks the start of Channel 4's Fake News Week. Every night we'll be looking at the phenomenon and how it's challenging our perceptions of the world around us. Donald Trump began his day with a tweet dismissing as fake news polls that suggested public dissatisfaction with his migrant ban. But despite his ready use of the label for pretty much anything he dislikes, Trump was seen by some as benefiting from made-up stories during the presidential election campaign. In a moment, we'll be looking at fake news on this side of the Atlantic. But first, our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris reports on Trump's relationship with the media and US attitudes to truth, lies, and the grey areas in between.
By the president's latest definition, fake news is not so much organised disinformation, more anything the media says that doesn't reflect him in all his glory. Only this morning he took to Twitter to invite followers to dismiss any unpleasant truths.
Any negative polls are fake news, just like the CNN, ABC, NBC polls in the election. I call my own shots, largely based on an accumulation of data, and everyone knows it.
But what data? In the case of his voter fraud claims, President Trump took up a tweet popular with conspiracy theory websites and ran with it without hard evidence that it ever happened.
So you think you're going to be proven correct in that statement?
Well, I think I already have. A lot of people have come out and said that I am correct.
Yeah, but the data has to show that 3 million illegals voted.
Forget that. Forget all of that.
It is the new normal that when the White House is cornered over a lie, it recasts what truth is.
Why did he do that? It undermines the credibility.
Here's a memorable exchange with Kellyanne Conway debating crowd sizes at the inauguration.
You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
Call me old-fashioned, but I still believe there's something as a verifiable fact and truth, and I don't believe in what Kellyanne Conway has called alternate facts, because that's straight out of George Orwell.
There are Orwellian moments on offer every day from this White House. Ask a question in the Oval Office about new Iran sanctions, and you'll need to leave.
They're not behaving.
Thank you, guys.
Non-compliance will not be tolerated.
Good morning. So many issues.
In the Democratic rough and tumble of America, the free press once had high standing. But Donald Trump declared war. At his only press conference since the election, he harangued outlets who challenged him.
Since you're attacking us, can you give us a question?
On that day, it was CNN.
Mr. President-elect, attacking
No,
our news
not
organization.
you. Not
can you give us a chance?
Your organization.
You are
is
attacking
terrible.
our President-elect.
Go ahead.
Can you
She's
state categorically,
asking a question.
Mr.
Don't be rude.
President-elect,
Don't be rude.
Can you
No, I'm
give
not
us a
going to give you a
question?
question. I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you state categorically?
You are fake news.
Sir, that nobody...
It's Trump's staff you can hear applauding, by the way. In truth, there was nothing fake about the story that had angered Mr. Trump. But in his battle with the so-called mainstream media, it's the fight, not who's right, that matters.
Trump made us part of his act. You know, he would point to us during his speeches and say, "Look at those bloodsuckers. Look at them. They're not on your side. I'm on your side." And that was very successful.
To make it perfectly clear, in a recent interview with Christian Broadcasting, the president painted it in the simplest of terms.
Yeah, I think the media is the opposition party in many ways. The dishonesty, the total deceit and deception.
But the president can only undermine the media effectively because so many Americans already distrust it.
I was just reviewing a survey. They asked 1,000 Americans what they thought was most threatening to the electoral system. One of the options was Russia, and they still chose the mainstream media as the biggest threat to the electoral system.
Conservative commentator Molly Hemingway says we can at least in part be blamed for our own undoing.
People really feel like the media have been playing partisan politics for too long, not trying to understand the whole diversity of the country, being overtly and unnecessarily hostile to a lot of conservatives. And so this is the culmination of a really long period of a breakdown in trust.
You know, I don't really buy that line of thought.
Back at the august Washington Post, Margaret Sullivan defends the media's record against allegations of bias.
You know, all the coverage of Syria, I think, was very critical of Obama and more.
But there is a blind spot, she concedes, in its coverage of Middle America.
I think where you can certainly fault the mainstream press in America is in failing to understand how important the center of the country was to the outcome of the election.
That, as you know, I have a running war with the media. They are among the most dishonest human beings on earth.
They like the fact that he's lying his way to the presidency. They like the fact that he's conning us and that we're horrified by it. All of that gives them, his voters, tremendous pleasure.
Perverse pleasure for his supporters and a critical tool for this president undermining those in the truth business to author a reality he prefers.
Kylie Morris in the United States. Well, now here, a survey for Channel 4 has found that only 4% of respondents shown 3 true and 3 fake headlines could actually accurately differentiate them all. So does Britain face the same dangers from the trend? And are we bothered if we do? Our Home Affairs correspondent Andy Davis has had a first look at the results.
In the political maelstrom of a US election, fake news tapped its richest seam yet.
The epidemic of malicious fake news and false propaganda.
Disinformation, fake news.
This is something that is constantly been disproved.
This isn't true. This isn't right.
Clinton branded a paedophile and the Pope endorsing Trump. They were made-up stories shared millions of times. But from Washington to Westminster, politicians are spooked.
This is the right.
Maybe England rugby players too.
There are quite a lot of fake news stories operating on Facebook that have died.
Random reality bending or downright democracy threatening. There's no getting away from it.
I'm not going to give you a question. You are fake news.
Fake news is big news.
This is a lie.
What do we mean by the phrase fake news? Deliberately false stories manufactured to fool you? Well, we can all agree on that one. But what about those satirical spoof news websites or real event news reports which clearly pander to an agenda? Is that fake news too? From a few drinking dens in Bristol, we invited some definitions. What do you understand by fake news?
Propaganda.
Well, it's
Media spin as well. Like, it might have some truth to it, but like maybe a word of truth, but not the whole truth.
When I say fake news, what comes to mind?
Today, clickbait.
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 Dodgy news stories, print and broadcast, aren't exactly new. It's just their breeding ground has got a whole load bigger.
People on their way to work filled up the travelling time in the good old way by reading all about it.
The old order of news looks increasingly quaint in an age of social media. For young people now, their main source of news.
Or click it, and that would be like, it's really bad, but it's like honestly the truth.
News?
But in the vast world of news, how easy is it to spot a fake? In a YouGov survey for Channel 4, 1,600 people were shown 6 headlines, 3 true, 3 fake. Just 4% correctly identified all 3 true stories and all 3 fake stories. Half thought at least one of the fake stories they were shown was true.
Question number 8. What is Scotland's largest island?
We tried out some of the headlines in Bristol. Pub quizzes first. Trump offering free one-way tickets to Africa and Mexico for those who want to leave America.
Yeah, probably true. He probably would do that.
Yeah, probably. It's very Trumpy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Iceland to host New Year's Eve party for asylum seekers. What do you think?
I think that's fake news.
I think it's fake news.
I think it's true. I'm going to say true. I'm going to say true as well. You just can't tell.
Half of those surveyed said they were worried about the effects of fake news, and that number was even higher among the under 25s. Are you worried by fake news?
No, not at all.
Why not?
Because people have a duty to research their own information.
I think it's very pernicious, actually. And it's fake, and it's not doing the media any good whatsoever, because it just makes me even more suspicious.
If you suspect a news story is fake, you can report it.
Facebook and Google are now looking at new ways to filter out or flag up fake news. But asked if Facebook and other social media sites like Twitter are doing enough to tackle fake news, 2/3 of those surveyed said they aren't. A majority also wanted the government to do more. Most of our interviewees in Bristol favoured more independent fact-checking.
I don't know if there's a role for the government, but I feel like there could be some outside body that could perhaps sort of put their stamp of approval.
If on Facebook you could just say, flag it, I don't think it's real, and someone could look into it, it's, you know, another way of catching all this news before it's getting to everyone.
I don't see how anybody can police it. If you're going to police it, then you have to police free speech. And how do you police freedom of speech?
So what do you do about it then?
Educate people.
We just got to learn to be more sensible when listening to gossip.
Sound advice indeed, but in this so-called post-truth world, the task of sifting gospel from gossip isn't always quite as black and white as we'd like.
How each of us decides, I've never been sure.
Well, with me now is the journalist Ella Whelan. She's the assistant editor at Spiked. From Westminster, we're joined by the Conservative MP Damian Collins, who's chair of the Select Committee, which has launched an inquiry into fake news. From Toronto, we have BuzzFeed's media editor Craig Silverman, and from Phoenix, Arizona, Paul Horner, who writes what he calls satire or hoax stories. His pieces were widely shared online in the run-up to the election. Paul Horner, let me begin with you. Could you raise your hand and promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in this interview? Why do you do it?
Hail Satan.
Why do you do it,
Hello?
Paul Horner? Yeah. Can you hear me? Oh.
Yeah. Can I first just start by saying that Donald Trump is an idiot and his supporters are morons?
Well,
and anyone who follows his stuff and believes anything he says is an idiot. They've shared my news as fact, tweeted it, shared it so many times. Like, everything they do is fake news. He is fake news, and he started this whole evil fake news thing. My stories, I've been doing this 6 years. Everything that's always been like pranks, hoaxes, satire, shenanigans, always gotten praise. I've always had fans. Ever since November 17th, like since this whole fake news thing started, this evil fake news thing started, suddenly I'm Satan and people have harassed me, and I'll ask them, what article are you even talking about? They don't even know my work. I just get lumped in with all these fake news like outlets that need to go. There's so many, Hustlers.com, like I could name so many that just do fake news to be fake news to get ad revenue.
But you did do stories, didn't you?
Purpose, everything is satire.
You did stories during the election
What's
campaign that got shared by Trump supporters, didn't you? So a lot of people would assume you were doing that because you believed in Trump. Now, you've just made clear that you clearly don't. So were you just doing it for the money or for the celebrity, or what motivates you?
Every story I wrote mocked Trump. Every story made them look like idiots. The only stories that, like the people that were sharing it, I was trying to get people not to vote for Trump, which I know I did a good job of doing. But I think the people that were continuing to share my stuff, even when I would put giant headlines on my stories like, "This is not real," it would still get shared by the alt-right, the conservatives, Bible thumpers, people that don't fact check. Something that actually I did an interview this morning with 780 AM. It's a major radio station here in the Valley in Phoenix, up in Flagstaff also. They said, and I quote, "Paul Horner has done a great service to the world by shedding light to the need for fact-checking and bringing light to fake news."
Okay.
So
let me go to Craig Silverman.
I never even thought of it that way. But
Craig Silverman, what has been the effect, do you think, of these sorts of stories? I mean, do you have any evidence that they changed anything, that people were sharing them because they believed them?
Well, I think there is a lot of evidence accumulated over the years from research that people do tend to want to react strongly to information that confirms what they believe. So it's probably safe to assume that folks who are already inclined to like Trump or who didn't like Clinton might be more inclined to share and to read stories that portray him in a positive light and her in a negative light. I think one of the things that people have been claiming that there's really no support for is that, fake news got Donald Trump elected. I think it certainly has had an effect on, the public debate, and it continues to spread now. But in terms of changing people's minds and telling them how to vote, I think that that's probably a step or two far in terms of trying to get a sense of the impact it had.
Now, the thing is, we started off thinking of fake news as news stories that were deliberately made up, that were not true. Now, Trump has tried to own the phrase fake news and redefine it as news that is either mistaken or later shown not to be quite true, or just news he doesn't like. So how do you own what the phrase really means?
Well, I think, to be honest, it's kind of a remarkable thing that in the span of, say 3 months, it's gone from meaning a relatively specific thing, as you said, a completely fake story created to fool people, usually for financial motive. And today the term is almost meaningless. It's gone from something that nobody had heard about, 4 or 5 months ago to something lots of people have heard about, but nobody really knows what it means. And I do think Trump has been in some ways effective in really muddying the waters on what the term fake news is. For him, it's a story he doesn't like. It's media he doesn't like. And you're seeing people on the right and the left start to adopt this term where, somebody on the right will call somebody on the left reporting fake news. And so the term, it's something that is just, people are using it for whatever purpose they want at that given moment.
But
and I think, unfortunately,
that?
it started to become almost meaningless.
I mean, didn't BuzzFeed play into that by publishing that, dossier in inverted commas about Trump and all the allegations supposedly gained by Russian intelligence? I mean, you printed stuff that you hadn't checked.
Well, there's a big difference and a big distinction in this. There's a difference between something that's 100% false that people put out there to fool people and a dossier that circulated at the highest levels of the government, that circulated among Washington press corps, that the intelligence officials in the United States briefed the president and the president-elect on, and that was then reported to exist and that briefing happened. That's a huge difference between something that somebody consciously makes up. And obviously that dossier was also compiled by a former Russia expert with MI6. So. But, to your point, I think that there is a lot of confusion about these elements. Something that is completely false versus something that has unverified elements and claims that really haven't been proven yet. These are all part of the information environment that we're in. Some stuff is completely false. Some stuff is in that gray zone. Some things are true but are being torqued in certain ways. And I think it's very confusing for the average person to make their way through those things.
Damian Collins, what has this got to do with Parliament? Why are you looking into it?
Well, we were very interested that in the studies done looking at the presidential election in America, that the prominence and the level of sharing of the most popular fake news stories about the election was greater than the sharing of the most prominent stories that were actually true, that came from legitimate news organisations. So there's got to be a big concern for democracy if fake news is starting to crowd out real news, and that people who are news consumers and sharers on sites like Facebook don't have the necessary tools to help them separate the fake from the non-fake.
So you're looking at regulation, are you?
Well, I think we're looking at a number of things. So sites like Facebook and Google already accept they have a social obligation to address pirated content online and illicit material. I think they have a social obligation as well towards to act against the distribution of known sources of fake news. I think it'd also be interesting to look at whether you could have verification tags, as Twitter have verified users, where the companies check that someone is real and the person they claim to be. Could we have a way of verifying sources of news? So where a news organisation or site is known not to produce fake news content, they get a kite mark to help direct and inform consumers that that's more likely to be a reliable source of information.
Let me bring in Ella Whelan. What do you think of that as an idea to look at? Is it anything to do with them, for a start?
Well, I'm really quite angry about what my fellow panellists have said, because what is being said here in the suggestion of regulation is essentially saying that the public can't be trusted to make their own minds about what is true and what is false in news. We are not trusted as members of the public to determine what's true and false. I mean,
but if the evidence is the public don't know the difference, then maybe that's true.
I don't think the evidence is that the public don't know the difference. The idea that fake news, and I mean, when we're talking about the fake news that was in relation to Trump, it was ridiculous. And I think most people really did a double take when they read that Hillary Clinton was a paedophile, some of the other completely ridiculous claims that were made. This is no effect on democracy. What has an effect on democracy is elected members of parliament saying that they want the state to regulate the press. That's shocking.
Paul Horner, your experience is that a lot of people didn't know the difference between what was true and what was fake, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the Trump supporters, they ran with it. They loved it. They anything that fit their agenda. Other stuff, they were called idiots, and I think I got a lot of people not to vote for Trump. I think, in all honesty, I think any news media organization out there that collects ad revenue and that tries to get supporters in any way is fake news. I think anything out there has some kind of fake news, meaning they're having an agenda. They put out news specifically, just what the last panelist heard or was saying, specifically to get those viewers And I mean, you can look at the local news. The local news is the worst fake news. I mean, what do you see? I mean, at least in the States. I don't know how it is over in Europe. I mean, that's why I took this interview with Channel 4 News, just because you guys are a little more. But I mean, all I hear from you guys is negative stuff on Trump. I never hear any positive stuff on Trump. I mean, that's fake news right there. But you guys are way better. That's why I took this interview.
But,
anyway,
Craig Silverman,
anyway,
I mean,
real quick.
Let me bring in Craig Silverman because we don't have a lot of time. Craig Silverman, is there any real difference between what they're doing in moral terms? You know, as Mr. Horner points out, you're all ultimately about getting ad revenue off the internet. You know, that's what really motivates you. You're a business, not a public service.
Well, the business aspect is key here, and we should also point out that Paul earns his money from advertising on the internet as well. Now, in terms of specific to BuzzFeed, we don't actually earn any money from the pages where our stories are. We do sponsored content. Not that that's a perfect model, but it's a different way where we don't get more money based on the number of clicks. But the financial incentive is a really important point here. It's one of the reasons why we saw a huge amount of fake news during the U.S. election, is that people in the United States and elsewhere around the world saw that it was a business opportunity.
Thank you all very much indeed for joining us tonight. Thank you. John.
And as you will know from the two of me that have been speaking to you, the Fake News Week is continuing this week. After the break, he's been one of the fixtures of the British art world for more than half a century. Now, Tate Britain is presenting a retrospective of his life's work, of Yorkshire's David Hockney. I've been talking to him. It will be his most comprehensive exhibition yet. As David Hockney turns 80, Tate Britain will showcase 60 years of his work. I went along to meet him.
Everybody, I mean, sees colour a bit differently. Everybody does. Everybody.
You wanna disappear in a crowd, just a stranger in a room. Wanna change your colours just for the light. With no words.
It's a garden, East Yorkshire. I noticed all the textures of the land. I mean, because it was different each day. I mean, there's different things. You see the corn growing up, then you'd see all the intense yellow.
Your two places of love and life are those that inform your pictures. It's as if California gave you colour and Yorkshire gave you shape, texture.
Well, yes. I mean, California's a marvellous light. I mean, that's why Hollywood's there, because of the light. You can see colour more, especially in the early morning and the evening, you can.
I'll tell you something else which really intrigues me is what you've been doing with modern technology, as we could call it. Those panels in which you're able with your thumb, your finger and a stylus sometimes to
just draw.
Yeah.
Drawing on an iPad. Well, I mean, I drew on an iPad. I started on an iPad in 2010, and but it took us 5 years before we realized the drawing that you could play back could be useful and you could use it. I mean, so every mark made was recorded. You can watch a drawing being made. Well, I mean, I'm still exploring that. I think it is a totally new medium, this.
But you almost edge out into the political with them too. There's a really lovely one which I think is about Europe, in which you've got these assorted plugs in the wall.
Oh yeah, that was drawn in Baden-Baden, because I'd taken my iPad and the iPhone, and then the plugs needed to plug them in were quite a few, and you needed this one and then this one. I put on the book, "Will Europe ever fit together?"
It was prophetic. What about what else is going on in life? Trump, Brexit. Do these things play on your mind?
Well, they do a little bit, but not that much.
You can live an artistic life and carry on.
Yes, I do. Yes, yeah.
Is there any other painter who is a great influence on you?
Well, there's Picasso. I mean, Picasso's a unique artist, actually. You can go on discovering Picasso still. He died 30 years ago, but there's still loads of things to discover in Picasso.
And are you still discovering yourself?
Yeah, yeah. Yes, I am. Yeah.
Hockney, Tate Britain from this week, fantastic.
That's it for tonight.
That's Channel 4 News. Good evening.
Bye-bye.